Federal Drive is presented by GEHA, Government Employees Health Association, proudly providing health and dental benefits to federal employees and their families. Visit GEHA.com.
A new federal spending forecast is out, and it paints two different pictures for defense and civilian agencies. The Professional Services Council projects that defense spending will keep climbing through 2035, but civilian agencies aren't so lucky. Analysts predict that non-defense budgets are likely to remain flat or shrink. Federal News Network's Anastasia Obis has more on the details. Anastasia, great to have you here.
Hi, Terry.
Tell us more about what PSC is thinking when it comes to federal spending over the next decade.
Yeah, so when they looked to build their forecast, they came up with three different scenarios. The first scenario was the OMB outlook, where the fiscal 2026 president's budget becomes the baseline. In that case, non-defense spending takes a significant hit, or it stays flat through 2028, and defense budget grows at about 2% every year. The second scenario was what they called the legislative logjam, essentially the environment that we're in right now. Defense still grows at roughly 2% annually, but non-defense budgets remain flat with some cuts and targeted rescissions. The third scenario was the big, beautiful bipartisan option, where both defense and non-defense budgets grow at about 2% per year. In the end, they see the second scenario, or the continuation of what we have right now, as the most realistic path forward. So the defense spending will continue climbing at roughly 2% annually after its first $1 trillion budget in fiscal 2026 due to reconciliation. And at the same time, cuts will continue to fall disproportionately on civilian agencies until elections change the balance of power, if that happens. Here's Mike Riley, a volunteer for PSC's Vision Federal Market Forecast.
On the civilian side, OMB's stated intent remains aggressive cutting, but the continuing resolution environment acts as a backstop to maintain a certain level of the status quo. Congressional action has been and will continue to be the real wild card as we see it. Our base case is a CR extending into calendar 2026 and possibly many departments and agencies ending up with full-year CRs. Standalone supplementals are possible, but not probable in the near term. And reconciliation remains a tool that can be used to add further targeted dollars for defense.
That's kind of a bleak picture, Anastasia. Are there shifts that are emerging in the Pentagon's priorities? What did PSC have to say about that?
Yeah, there are a couple of things that emerged from discussions with defense stakeholders. The thing that was revealed is a strategic realignment in the Pentagon priorities. The Indo-PACOM still has the status of elevated importance, but Northcom and Southcom are gaining importance since this administration and the department have put greater focus on homeland defense, border security, and expanding its presence in Latin America. Here's Jason Dombrowski, a volunteer for PSC's Vision Federal Market Forecast.
This year was a bit of an interesting year for us. A lot of defense folks, right, acknowledged the growing importance under this administration, right? But also a lot of consternation about the directions the administration might be going and just kind of the lack of clarity. First of all, of course, there's some continuing trends, right? Deterring China, integrated deterrence, that sort of, pivot to the Pacific. Of course, border security. The department finds itself in an uncomfortable position that they are getting a little bit more heavily involved in domestic politics than they would otherwise prefer to.
As you put all of that together and you think about the future of defense, are there winners and losers that sort of are emerging from this realignment?
Yeah, and the volunteers like to kind of do this winners and losers in the defense outlook. And one area that has emerged as a definite loser is the Defense Department's buying power, purchasing power, which continues to erode as inflation and reshoring efforts drive up the costs. Another area that emerged as a loser was advisory and assistance services, along with legacy systems. And at the same time, Africa Command and Central Command are being pushed lower on the priority list. Contested logistics were kind of a toss-up, but they're kind of gaining traction as a priority. And at the same time, scalability is emerging as a clear winner in this. Research and development spending is increasing, but only in a few areas. And those areas are related to advanced weapon systems, drones, and energy. Also, one thing to highlight is sustainability initiatives. They appear to be split. The green side of sustainability is losing ground and is kind of a clear loser. But at the same time, efforts tied to energy resilience are gaining momentum. For example, the Army wants to deploy microreactors on military bases by 2028.
There's a lot of change there. And on top of that, we have the Secretary's proposed reforms to the acquisition process. How do those factor in to the changes in priorities?
Yeah, so Hagsat's reforms emphasize greater competition, faster delivery, making commercial technology as a default option. But one thing that volunteers pointed out is the department's ability to implement those changes, given deep personnel cuts that have been happening across the Defense Department and the entire federal government since January. And we've been covering that thoroughly. In addition to that, the department's new acquisition strategy promises to lower barriers to entry for non-traditional contractors and startups. But at the same time, there is what they call a healthy cynicism. Everyone's just kind of saying, let's wait and see. And how is this time any different? Here's Dombrovsky again.
This administration has made a big priority of trying to attract new people. And we looked at the pros and cons of it. It's probably worth noting that aside from a few very notable successes that we can all figure out, right, there hasn't really been much movement in this regard.
That's Federal News Network's Anastasia Obis. Anastasia, thanks for bringing us this story.
Thank you, Terry.
You can find her story at federalnewsnetwork.com.
Phil McNamara, former Assistant Secretary for Administration at the Department of Transportation, emphasizes that in government, relationships matter more than titles. On this episode of Lessons in Leadership, McNamara shares how he's led large teams, navigated the future of work, and built trust across agencies. In conversation with Shane Canfield, CEO of WEPA, he offers practical insights on leading with humility, empathy, and clear communication in today's complex federal landscape.
Hello, and welcome to the Lessons in Leadership podcast. I'm your host, Shane Canfield, CEO of WEPA. Today, I'm joined by Phil McNamara, former Assistant Secretary for Administration at the Department of Transportation, and also former Assistant Secretary for Intergovernmental Affairs at the Department of Homeland Security. Welcome, Phil, and thank you for joining me.
Thank you so much, Shane.
You've spent time leading in multiple agencies, including both DHS, DOT. What's something you learned early in your leadership career that carried you over into future positions?
Before I dive in, let me just for any federal employees listening to this podcast or recent former federal employees, I want to say, I see you, I value you, I thank you for your service on behalf of the American people. I wish things weren't happening the way they are happening now, but just a thank you. So you're right, Shane. I've been fortunate to serve in government twice now. If there's one thing that really kind of speaks to leadership philosophy, it's to listen first. I think back to onboarding at Homeland Security in 2009, right? I was coming from politics. I was in my mid-30s at that point. I learned you have to listen first. There's always pressure to immediately sort of make your mark. But, I think if you take the time to listen to people, whether that's career staff, whether it's, external stakeholders, build the trust, you will then be set up for sort of longer term success. And, whether it's, responding to, a crisis or just responding to, an employee concern or trying to drive, some sort of, initiative, employees, they want to be seen, they want to be heard, they want to be respected. So I think that it's that foundational lesson.
In your time in government, you've also held multiple different roles where you were managing personnel, as you've been talking, but personnel and HR policies.
Yeah.
And how did those kinds of people-driven positions affect your leadership style?
I think, if anything, the people-driven positions has made me a better communicator. There's just so much information to process that I had to be able to express what was going on to employees and leadership in a succinct and, explanatory way. And, obviously, during my time at DOT, right, the administration passed the largest infrastructure, bill in a generation, right? And a big part of that at DOT was getting that money out the door, right, quickly. But it also meant that, DOT had to, hire thousands of new employees, right? Here I was, right? I had to learn about all these hiring authorities that we could figure out a way to expedite hiring and meet the demands of what the administration wanted us to get accomplished. And, I couldn't go to Secretary Pete, right, and start talking to him about the intricacies of Title V or OPM regulations for delegated hiring authorities and everything that was entailed there in the same way that I could talk to my HR directors about that, right? So I had to find a way to, get the information to where it needed to be in the form that was most useful to the audience, right? It's sort of like, what is your audience, right? And I think that really helped me cut through what was necessary and what was sort of, fluff.
Absolutely, I agree with that completely. And was there a time when you had to make a difficult decision as a federal leader? And if you could unpack that a little bit, how did you work through that challenge?
Looking back, I think one of the hardest things we dealt with was in 2021 as we were sort of, we were all remote. We still had thousands of air traffic controllers that had to report on site. But for the most part, DOT we were doing this remotely. And so, how were we going to bring employees back to the office in a safe way? It really challenged me to think sort of more holistically, realize there's not one answer. It made me be more flexible. We had thousands of employees who now had been, working remotely for 18 months. How were we going to bring them back? And I really relied on, on my team to be my sounding board, to help craft the best approach possible. Where I sat, right, I had the competing demands of balancing the employee concerns with the administration's priority, right? So I think it was very challenging. Employees and people are an agency, a company, an organization's most valuable asset, right? And so, I was deeply, deeply committed to ensuring that we did this in a way that was sort of very employee-centered. That, I think, was one of the hardest challenges we solved. And, fast forward now to, 2025 with the Trump administration and just, a full-fledged 5 days a week back in the office. I don't know if anyone's really figured out the magic sauce on this, whether it's the federal government or the private sector. Everyone's still grappling with that.
Yeah. If you were to go back to the start of your career, what's one piece of advice that you would give yourself now?
The first that's really easy is just to take a long view, right? Which is that, you can get so wrapped up in whatever you're dealing with in the here and now in that day, and then just kind of take a step back and say, will any of that really matter in 5 months or 5 years? And if and if it matters in 5 years, okay, yeah, invest the time and the, emotional energy into it. And I think the other thing that just, I would tell myself, and a constant reminder is, people will say, oh, will you meet with this, young person who's just graduating college and looking for a job? Or will you meet with this intern who's down in DC for the summer? And I always say yes. No matter how busy my calendar is, I will always say yes. And what I always tell interns and folks starting out, early in their career here in DC is relationships matter more than titles. Early on, right, you're running this rat race, and you're trying to climb the ladder and get to that next rung, and chase the next cool job title. But I think what truly propels someone's career is the network of people, the colleagues, the mentors, the collaborators you build, along the way, and the people you work with, right? Today may become your partners down the road. So, relationships matter. Invest in those relationships. You have to show up with respect, shared values, mutual trust. But I'd say invest in relationships is just the constant reminder.
Who is one person, it can be somebody you know personally or somebody well-known, who has impacted your leadership style?
You're not going to get me to pick my favorite. But, one thing I will say I took away from my most recent boss, Secretary Pete, was just a reminder why we're doing the work we're doing, right? In particular, I think in the federal government, and it's so easy, right, to talk in either jargon, acronyms, and so I mentioned earlier the infrastructure law, and so for instance, there's a brand new grant program in the infrastructure law called the Bridge Investment Program, and it was, I think, $15 billion over 5 years to essentially repair, rehabilitate poor or at risk of being poor, failing bridges across the country. In the federal government, we can talk about it as the Bridge Investment Program and $15 billion, right? And what Secretary Pete always challenged us to do is talk about that in ways that average Americans would understand, right? And so what average Americans understand is if they have a bridge in their community, and that bridge is frequently having detours or lanes of the bridge have to be sort of taken out of service, and that causes delays. Well, we can talk about the investment we're making, and we're going to repair that bridge, and it's going to be more safe, and it's going to reduce delays or detours, and it's going to save you time on your commute. That's far different than talking about a $15 billion bridge investment program, right? Anytime he would always challenge us just to constantly make the work we're doing matter to the American people. And so that's something that I take with me.
Well, this has been absolutely wonderful, Phil. Thank you so much for your time. And thanks to everybody for tuning in. This is Shane Canfield, CEO of WEPA, reminding you to empower your team and embrace challenges. Until next time on Lessons in Leadership.
Find the full podcast and future episodes of Lessons in Leadership on the Federal News Network app and anywhere you enjoy your podcasts.